All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event of the MyData Brazil Hub. My name is Nicolas Zingales. I'm a professor at FGV and coordinator of this hub. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, MyData is a non-profit organization whose purpose is to empower individuals by improving their right to self-determination regarding their personal data. It has close to 100 organizational members and 400 individual members from over 40 countries and 26 local hubs. Ours is one of those hubs that was established in 2019. Today we chose to invite two speakers to have an introduction to the concept of MyData operators, which is an umbrella term that includes a wide range of entities that provide this kind of services that empower individuals. I'll let the speakers introduce themselves in the interest of time. I should mention that we are recording the event, but if you are objecting to the publication of the section in which you are speaking, we will edit the video and remove it. Yeah, so with all that said, I'll leave the floor to Josh. Josh, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the call here. I've got a pack of slides that I'm going to talk through. I'll give a little introduction to myself, and then I think Rodrigo, you're going to be able to pick up and ask some questions about the slides and give a more local perspective. So I'll share my screen now. Yeah, I can do that. Nicola, could I have permission to share my screen?
I apologize. That's something I should have done earlier. I just made you a co-host now, as well as Rodrigo.
Perfect. So hopefully you can all see that now. Nicola, thank you for the introduction. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking more about MyData specifically, but I'm going to talk about how MyData as an organization is thinking about interoperability and why that's important. And that will lead us into the story about the MyData operators. Just quickly, just so you can see my background, where I come from, what my biases are. So I help run the MyData operator thematic group. And that's where this presentation is coming from. I'm the executive director of a non-profit organization called Coalition. We're a research technology organization that helps promotes innovation with personal data in a responsible way. We've done quite a lot of work, particularly around the collection of personal data in the Internet of Things. And in that context, then I chair a standards committee at OASIS around what's known as the classification of everyday living. So behavioral attributes collected by Internet of Things devices. I also run a wearables business called Active Insights that sells devices for healthcare professionals around the world. So the reason I bring that up is that we collect their data about people on a daily basis. So the collection of data about people and helping people to navigate their rights with respect to that data is something I do deal with on a daily basis. And I also have an honorary fellowship at the University of Exeter, where I have two PhD students that I help supervise in the area of machine learning and artificial intelligence around behavioral data. So broad range of stuff, but all very much focused in this area. So if we're going to talk about interoperability, it's worth thinking about what the definition is. And the definition that we've been using in MyData over the last 4 or 5 years is the level of conceptual interoperability model. It's the LCIM. And I think this was presented first back in 2016. So it's something we've been living with for a while. And it poses a ladder of interoperability. And it somewhat suggests that we should move up this ladder in one go, and I'm not sure that that's completely correct. But at the bottom, we have a rung which says that we've got no interoperability at all. In the first 2 rungs, we can start thinking about some of the technical levels of interoperability. about making APIs that can talk to each other, making sure that those interfaces are common and the data structures are common. As we move up to the next level, we can start looking at the semantic levels. So making sure that the data means the same thing in two different organizations. And at the top level, we move to the ability where organizations actually have a shared understanding about how they move data around the place, about what the roles are, and about how they think the data should be treated, some of the governance levels. And at the highest levels of interoperability between organizations, what we see is that organizations can change, both change and change together, and maintain levels of interoperability. And that's what we mean by dynamic interoperability. Within the MyData operators paper, we use those three levels, the higher levels of organizational, semantic, and technical. And one of the departures from this model is that we suggest that actually we can make progress on these at different rates. There are things that we can do at an organizational level sometimes earlier than we can do at a technical level. This is a widely used model, and I'll give one example about a national or a regional implementation. It's used and referenced in the European interoperability framework. And it's quite a useful document. This is a little bit, hasn't been advanced much over the last couple of years, but it's quite useful and used by governments within Europe. You can see it's picking up the three levels there of the technical interoperability, the semantic interoperability, and the organizational interoperability that come from the model. And there's added a further one, the legal interoperability. And that's very obvious within the context of the European Union, where we know that we're looking at a large group of countries which are trying to harmonize many of their legal aspects. It, of course, poses some challenges when we're looking at this on a cross-jurisdictional basis. And so from a MyData perspective, we would tend not to sit at talk about the legal interoperability as well, but it is something to think about, particularly as we can see Europe beginning to move towards regulating for interoperability. And I think that's something that we're going to see more over the next 10 years. It's an area definitely to watch. So if we've got a rough working definition of what we mean by interoperability, we've got to think about why that's important. And that's where we start dropping down into the principles of MyData. Interoperability helps to provide transparency, and it helps to provide usability. Individuals see the same things again and again, and that's where the standardized interfaces come in. So if an individual is used to seeing data presented in a certain way, then it will make it much easier for them to understand the differences between different services. It allows us to build roaming possibilities, so people can move through different sectors. But more importantly, it allows what we call substitutability. And substitutability is at the core of choice. So if as an individual, I can swap my data and move my data and move my allegiance from one type of organization to another, and that I get a complete duplication of the underlying core elements of functionality, then I have choice, and I have real choice that I can execute in the marketplace. And that can be a very powerful way of achieving change alongside regulatory possibilities. So that's why I might want to do it. So how do I go about doing it? These are the steps that we've identified within MyData about how we can move towards interoperability and greater interoperability. At the first level is how do we share a common goal? And I think the fact that you're on this call today, that you obviously have some interest in or are well aligned with the MyData principles, and that you have a belief that the individual should be at the core of the data that's held around them. And that's a very useful starting point. So to be able to understand that organizational understanding about a common goal allows us to do some work within MyData, which is more difficult in other areas. The next stage is to be able to establish common understanding and definitions. That is the core objective of the Understanding MyData Operators paper that was published earlier this year that I'm going to carry on to tell you a little bit more about. Because up until now, we've not really had clear language to talk about these types of intermediaries and these types of operators in a consistent way. Once we've been able to describe these different organizations on a similar basis, we can start to identify common processes. And then we can think about how we harmonize those most common processes. So from an individual's perspective, I'm seeing the same thing again and again. So the job that I need to do in one place looks the same as the job that I need to do in another place. And once we've got to that stage, then we can start thinking about what are the common governance aspects. So what are the common rules that dictate how we move data around under the control of the individual. So that takes us then to the definition of the MyData operator. For those of you that are familiar with the MyData declaration, you will have seen this visualization before. So we call this is the coat hanger visualization, where we've got the person at the top and their interactions within the data world is facilitated through an operator. This operator helps them to negotiate the digital space and helps them to coordinate the movement of data from a data source to a data using service so that that data can be made to work for the individual. Now, this is not a new definition. And when you look at the literature, you can see references to intermediaries going back for over 20 years. So this is quite a well understood definition. And what we've tried to do is to bring all this together to have a very straightforward and coherent description about how these different types of organizations work. I'll not go through some of them there, but hopefully some of those will be familiar to some of you. So what we're trying to do now, where organizations typically manage the whole value chain. They manage the collection of data, the management of that data, and then the subsequent use of that. And we all know that what that means is it's very difficult to integrate data from multiple sources. So if I've got data in one place, on one service on the internet, it's almost impossible even to be able to take across the simple things as my name and address from one service to another, let alone actually the deeper data and the outputs from that data. So what we're trying to do is to move to a situation where we place the individual at the center of the management of that data. So data which is collected once can be used and reused. And so you can see that we're trying to complete the circle between these different services so that data that's been collected on one point, we as an individual can control about where that's reused again. And so that allows us then to update that original visualization of the MyData ecosystem, where importantly, we recognize that an individual may have multiple different types of organizations that it uses to help manage data. It may well be in the same transaction that they use different operators. It may be that an individual uses one platform to manage their consent and permissions, and it uses a different platform to manage the actual movement of the data based on those permissions. So we have multiple operators, and we recognize that we have multiple data sources that can be pulled together to do jobs by different data using services. And then the other element that's been added here is this idea of ecosystem governance. So once we recognize that there are multiple players who can act in concert all the time, we have to think about what the common rule set is that they work within and how the individual recognizes that those are following those rules. So the MyData operator can be downloaded here. There is a Portuguese translation for that. So the slides, if you've not got them yet, they will be made available. And thank you to Nicola and the team who put a lot of effort into making that translation. So what I'm going to do quickly now is just summarize some of the other outputs from the paper. It's worth reading, but here are the headlines. I talked a little bit about interoperability, but I'm now going to talk about the reference model that's contained in the paper, talk about the work that we're doing to recognize the different MyData operators there are around the world, and touch very quickly on governance and business models. I'm going to pause for a moment there and just check that everybody's with me and we're happy with the pace things are going, and if there are any immediate questions.
Perfect. I have a question, or maybe you prefer at the end.
I don't mind.
So I have it's very interesting when you talk about enabling substitutability, and what you are saying there is the opposite of churn. And you know that most companies, they try to fight with churn. They say how we make our users not going outside our organization. So my question there is, how do you believe that companies are today thinking about taking this data to another company, or what do you think, or if you think that they will change their mindset in the future?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. I think one is that recognizing whenever you erect a barrier to churn, you also erect a barrier to entry. They are one and the same. So as you try to stop individuals leaving your organization, you actually your offering, you actually make it more difficult to join. So you can flip this substitutability question around and say what it means is it's going to be much easier for you to invite a consumer, an individual who's using another service onto your platform because of the interoperability between them. And so that's one answer. I think the other answer is about the regulatory response to that. So there is a regulatory response to artificially erecting those walls to maintain customer bases. And particularly if you've got an abusive market situation where you've got very large players, then the regulator will move against them. And what we can do by showing that interoperability is possible, we can help regulators to see that they can regulate for interoperability. And I think we've seen a lot of this already. For many years, the fights that the European Union has had with Microsoft in terms of bundling, we know the regulators move in that space. And so showing that this is possible is important. I think the last I would say is we are talking about the interoperability here between the intermediaries as well. And I think while a data using service or someone who's storing data or aggregating service will be very resistant to making people move and very resistant to interoperability, there is more opportunity for intermediary services to accept that there is going to be a wider number of smaller businesses that are going to serve individuals in their own niche ways. So I think there's more opportunity there.
Great, thank you.
I'll carry on. I'm happy, Nicola, to be interrupted if people have raised their hands and stuff. So,
sure.
But I'll carry on for now.
Please.
So, at the heart of the MyData operator paper is the reference model, and this is trying to establish a common way of describing these different intermediaries, and it describes 9 functional elements, and these are the elements that affect how easy it is for an individual to use data, how transparent the use of that data is, and how human-centric it is. And we also do look within about how well the infrastructure supports open competition, so playing to this point of substitutability. The reference model is a result of iterative synthesis. So we identified, if you see in the paper, there are nearly 50 authors in that paper. We worked with that many people to understand what was the current practice within the marketplace. As a team, as a group, we worked together to synthesize that, to understand that. We present it back to those proto operators and say, does this describe how your business works? And we went through that loop several times to create something which was not a theoretically derived model, but an empirically derived model that was tested on the marketplace. The functional elements are there, the ones that are there are the ones which are specifically relevant to the operators, that differentiate between them and that are valuable to individuals. And to make it very clear, for example, the topic of security isn't there. It's not because security is not important, but it's a hygiene factor. It's something that we expect all of these organizations to do, and so therefore it doesn't help us split them apart. The last important point is that this is not a single template for how you build an intermediary. We're not expecting all operators to have all the functional elements, and we see some really, really great operators, intermediaries, that just do a couple of things really, really well. But these are the ones which are generally common and accessible across the model. So the functional elements within the reference model are these. So on the left-hand side in yellow are the ones which are about the individual engaging in the service, who they are, and the permissions that they're providing, the consents that they're providing around the management of the data. In the middle, in grey, these are the things that are about the service. So some intermediaries, for example, list lots of different services that an individual could use. They could say, I've got my data, I could use my data to do X, Y, and Z. I could do these different things with it, and they do that sort of service roster. Some specialize in monetizing data or delivering other types of value exchange. many operators, of the intermediaries within the MyData space don't go anywhere near monetization. They don't believe that that's an appropriate thing to do, but we're allowing for it in the model. On the right-hand side in blue, this is all about the data. The data model, how do we control the semantics of that data? How do we move data around? And how do we store data for an individual? We see many intermediaries are closely linked to storage capabilities, typically specific to that individual personal data stores. And so that's actually included in that model. And lastly, there are two that sit around this. One is the governance support. So what hooks does an intermediary have to show that it's working within a governance regime? So not the governance regime itself, but how does it show that it's working within, and what facilities does it provide? For example, it may be about assurances around different companies within the ecosystem. So what checks do they have in place? And then lastly, the logging and accountability. So making sure that an individual can see when their data is used, how often it was used, what other services that it went into. So there's a lot more detail about this within the report, but that's the top line of how we've described these different intermediaries.
Josh, may I interrupt just for a second?
Yeah, please.
To ask. So all these are different functionalities, as you call them, and no one it seems to be a necessary element. So I wonder if there's a minimum common denominator, and probably this is something that you're going to develop in the next slides. But what is the minimum core? I mean, I understand that the goal is that all these operators would enable a human-centric ecosystem. So I guess we will need to explain what that means for people who are not familiar with MyData, and to understand what is the minimum common denominator.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, as you've said there, the minimum is that they work within an ecosystem, that they work to exchange data so that we can demonstrate some level of interoperability. And that's why I started with interoperability at the top of this. You can see, in fact, you can put this against any of the GAFA models. You can put this against Amazon, Facebook, and you will see that they do all these things, but they do it entirely within their own firewalls, their own walled gardens. And so the important thing that when we're looking for in assessing MyData operators is their ability to exchange this data from outside the business. And that's part of what we've done, where we've tried to recognize these MyData operators. So I'll carry on, Nicola, and talk about the process that we've had there. So I've talked about the journey of interoperability as the title for this presentation. And so we're looking for what are the minimum interoperability criteria for these operators. So that's how we judge, is on the minimum basis of interoperability. And in addition to that, we are looking for people that are always strive to work within and towards open ecosystems. And we recognize this is a changing world. There are some small organizations which are completely open and they have very little to lose. And we have some large organizations which are making strong moves to be more and more open in this space. And so we see both ends of that. So the criteria that we've used to come to your point, Niccolo, is we've asked the organizations to self-describe. And this is an important stage. We're not setting external criteria at this stage because we don't understand enough about how this space works. And what we're doing is we're using this award as an opportunity for people to tell us and the rest of the world that all these applications are available to the public, how their systems run against that interoperability model, that reference model. We've asked them to show that they've got alignment to the MyData principles of human centricity. And that's our first step towards talking about governance. And then this is a really difficult bit, but we've also asked those applicants to describe how they are transparent in the work they do. And a lot of that is fulfilled with just writing the application itself, but also how their systems make sure that they treat the person as the primary beneficiary. And I think that's an interesting thing to move forward. And we're certainly beginning to see the use of the word fiduciary more and more within this space. So where the intermediary is actually placing the needs of the individual they're serving before their own needs. And so that's a great way of showing the person as the primary beneficiary. And what we're beginning to do now is to evolve these and think about how we make these criteria more objective, more human-centric as we move forward. So far in 2020, here are the list of the organizations that have gone through this application process. And it's a huge amount of time and effort that they've put in to providing a very open disclosure of how their business runs. And I think they have to be commended on the time that they've taken and the amount of information they've put forward. I think these span 15 different countries and multiple different sectors. There is still a quick plug. There is still an opportunity to enter. The third round of the final call for the 2020 award opens this week. And will be announced at the beginning of December, and there's an application form there. Even if you're not interested, it's worth having a look at the application because you can get to see about what the process is. So hopefully that's interesting to people. I'm going to touch on two quick topics then before we close. I mentioned the ecosystem governance at the beginning. And this is a quote from the pack. From the report, that balanced and fair relationships between people and organizations do not emerge automatically in personal data ecosystems, and that there needs to be some explicit methods for human-centric governance to guarantee that the principles are followed. And I think that we recognize that beyond the regulation, which happens on a jurisdictional basis, there is common work that we can do to think about what are the rules for governance of this data that will move across different jurisdictions. And I think that's part of what the role for MyData can be, is about how do we work across jurisdictions to understand what are the governance roles that are important. I think within the report, we pick up three areas. We talk about that jurisdictional legislation level at the top, and we talk then actually at the bottom about what the responsibilities are, the responsibilities that an individual and an organization have between them too. And between those are really strong opportunities as MyData to think about what are the human-centric rules for governance in these types of transactions. And I think one of the things that you'll see a lot from MyData over the next 12 months is work around governance. One of the things I just put in for this presentation was that there is now a leak out for the European Data Governance Act, which is due to be published officially in a couple of weeks. And there is quite a lot around, there are three sections with that. First one is around public sector data sharing. The second one is around intermediaries. And the third sector is around data altruism. But we're going to be interested to see how the leaked drafts vary from the final one that we see in a couple of weeks. If you're interested in that, there is a chat running in the Slack forum with a leak, and a load of people who've read that and provided commentary on it. Business models, again, this is another difficult area that we need to grow going forward. I think in the long run, we recognize that if we're going to have true interoperability, there needs to be some convergence on business models. And that's not to say that there is one business model at all. And it's not to say that MyData, or we know what the range of business models should be. But if we look at how these markets evolve, we will expect to see some convergence on a range of different business models. And as MyData, I think what we need to do is to anticipate where this goes, to make sure that those are articulated well and they look after the needs of the individual, and that the flows of revenue are as visible as the flows of data. I think that's the objective that we want to get to. And this is probably the area where most work needs to be done. Nicola, just to look at your question again about some of the common factors between these organizations. I did a little mapping exercise for those organizations which have already applied. Within the application form, you're asked to rate how important different elements are. And when you start to look at how this splits out, there are three types of data operator, or three sort of standard areas that people tend to work on. We see the delivery of personal data storage as one area of functionality. We see another area which is around identity and permissions. There's a lot of operators that do a lot of work. They don't really care about delivering services or storing data, but they help the individual manage their identity and permissions. And then on the other side, we're beginning to see more operators concentrating on the services side, which I think is really interesting, because the operators, these intermediaries, are only valuable in that they enable an individual to do new and exciting and useful things with their data. And so I'm expecting, as the space matures, to see more and more organizations focusing more on how they deliver services and help the individual to access services. Before I close, I'm just going to do a quick digression into the MyData conference. The MyData conference is running in December. There are a couple of really good sessions. There's one excellent session on the Friday, the MyData operators, a view from LATAM. But here are a list, and these will be available in the slide pack, so I'm not going to go through them now, but I've just picked out those which have got a particular focus on the operator, so that if you were looking to pick at what sessions to go to and you were interested in this space, then there's a short guide for you there. So in the ongoing steps, what are we doing? We continue to try and inform regulation development. We've been working quite closely with some elements of the European Commission leading up to that Data Governance Act. We're beginning to see that cities are a really interesting unit of economic activity in which we can drive initiatives. Both Lyon and Helsinki have been very explicit. Well, Helsinki has actually used the reference model in their request for proposals for their new data initiatives within the city. And we're seeing similar things in France as well. So I'm collecting those. So if you know of any other city initiatives which are working within this space, be great to let us know, because we're seeing that we can influence those in a way where it's much more difficult to influence at a country level. I've mentioned that we're going to continue to work on the governance approaches, and there's some more definition work around the rest of the model to think about the interactions with the data sources and the data using services. We're working within the community to develop small projects on interoperability where we get 2 or 3 of these operators, these intermediaries, to work together to exchange some data. These little micro collaborations seem to be a really nice way of getting things moving. And within that, we're also working on technical tools. So there's a piece of work to look at some common schema elements. So taking a human-centric schema for data management and thinking about what can MyData add to that. And as I said, we will continue to evolve the MyData Operator Award, the criteria that we use to assess those awards going forward, to make them more objective and more useful. So that's me. Thank you very much for your time.
Perfect, thank you. Fantastic introduction. I'm gonna pass the floor to Rodrigo immediately, but I cannot refrain from adding 2 quick comments. So one is, you mentioned the EU Data Act that has leaked and we are expecting in a couple of weeks. What we are expecting also from the EU is a Digital Markets Act that will regulate the big players. And one of the requirements would be requirements of interoperability, and other requirements would be related to data sharing of these intermediaries. So there is a role there also for, trusted intermediaries to allow you to bring the data from one of these big players to another. So I think that those 2 initiatives are mutually reinforcing. And then another thing that you mentioned is these initiatives of the MyData community to create guidelines and try to address all of these questions that you have laid out for us. And so these are open groups that everyone is welcome to join. There's a Slack channel where people can go, of the MyData organization, and contribute and be part of this movement. And just a quick addition also, Barcelona, I think, should be a city that would fit into your list. They have developed these new data governance approaches that are quite interesting. But I don't want to take more of the time, because I want to hear also what Rodrigo has to say with some practical experience from their perspective as Wipson, a personal data intermediary that I think will be quite representative of some of these scenarios that we've been talking about. So Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Great. So thank you first, Joss, and Nicole also for the intro. So yes, I would like to share with you our experience with Wipson, and it's very interesting because as I prepare a presentation that I will share with you now, a lot of the words that Joss mentioned are also mentioned here, and it was not on purpose, but it's because these main values or around data are shared. So we're very happy to be very aligned with MyData, and just to start, that this guidance that MyData is creating is not just to put like some rules, but it's because people that are working in MyData, they understand the data ecosystem, they believe and how the data ecosystem will go to the future. So this guidance, I believe that is the best way practices to have a long-term solution and build new solutions around data. So to start, let me share my screen. And you see it here, there?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm Rodrigo Arrazabal. I'm Wibson CEO. Also I'm a team leader of PIMCity. PIMCity, which means Personal Information Management System. That was one of the names that was in one of the slides of JOS. PIMCity is an European consortium to create new solutions for European citizens to control and to get more value for their data. And I'm also a member of MyData. So a quick introduction maybe of what is Wibson. Wibson empowers consumers to control their data. Wibson is a startup that is globally, but today our focus or our team is based in Latin America. And what we give to the user, after years working on data monetization, we realized that users didn't have control, and even more, didn't have transparency about their data. Who is using their data, who have their data, what they can do with their data. So Wibson app allows you to discover which companies are holding your data, which type of data these companies have about you. Also, we give more transparency also if your data have been part of a data leak, which companies are spamming you. And after giving all this transparency to the user, we give control. Now that you know who have your data, you can decide, for example, which company can continue holding your data and which one not. So in the control is that we have an automated data subject request system where you can see all the companies and you can select which companies should delete your information. So once you click there, we are in charge and we send all the requests to the correspondent TPO. We also have other solutions, such as you can stop spammers and limit also now some social media companies, such as Google, on the use of your personal information. So this is Wibson, and something I think is very important that I mentioned before is values. I believe that for an operator, the value is the key for a long-term success. Today, there are a lot of new companies and startups, not in the data ecosystem, but around the world, that doesn't determine a mission, a vision, or a value for their companies. And I believe that if you are working around data and users' data, this is key. Like companies need to understand this. Why? Because it's like a bank. You are managing money of someone, so you need them to trust. In this case, you are managing users' data. So you have to be very, very sure of what's your north, what's your values, and that you will not change that. Maybe you can change different type of solutions, but your core values doesn't have to change. So I believe that to adopt MyData values is crucial to build long-term solutions around data solutions. In our case, our values, for example, is transparency, control, and balance. And these are three words that were mentioned a lot by Joss. So that's why I believe that it's very, very important to be aligned on this. In our case, transparency is because we believe that consumers have complete visibility in which companies hold their data. Control, as users need to have always in control about their information. And balance, because we don't want also to destroy the ecosystem and to destroy companies, but we want to build a more trustful ecosystem for both. And now I want to share you a little bit of information that we learned in this last month. So as I mentioned before, users using Wibson app, they can send different data subject requests with their app. And I want to share you how companies are answering to the users. So if we see in a worldwide perspective, the 59% of the companies are answering to a data subject request of the user. So when a user sends a request to delete their information, 59% of the companies are answering. The other percentage, they never answer to the user request. So how these companies are answering? Well, we divided in some categories. For example, the 8.8% of the companies say that they don't hold users' data. So we believe that maybe after a certain period, the company already deleted, or they don't have the technology or the intelligence to know if they really have this data from the user. 22% deleted the data as the first answer. They deleted and they confirmed that their data have been deleted. 2.2 say that they cannot delete it because of legal, especially financial companies, that they say that they need that type of information for the future. 11% ask for confirmation, especially, okay, your request have been managed by a third party. We need to reconfirm that it is you. 23% ask to delete your data from their site. They say, okay, please enter to your account, and then there inside you have to start all the process to delete your information. If you start there, and then they will send you an email, and well, it's very complex. And 19.8% ask you to verify your ID. So ask you for your passport, document. Some companies like airlines ask you your like account number, the last flight that you took to be sure that it's you. And the 13% create a ticket, and that ticket you can it's distributed uniform in the other categories. So this is how companies are answering today to the people. And something very, very interesting is, okay, how companies from Europe and the United States are answering comparing to the rest of the world, because they are the companies with the main regulations. So let's check what happens between the rest of the world and the United States and Europe. So what we did is we divided the companies per country or per continent, and we can see that today, after 2 years of GDPR and a couple of months of CCPA, companies that are in Europe and the United States answer to even more than 2 times than companies that are I put as rest of the world, companies that are not in that regions. So what we see is that these regulations, yes, are changing the ecosystem and are changing the mindset of the companies, but it's not enough. It's not enough because we need to create more solutions and to make it easier. So here I put a little like a summary of what I believe that also an operation, a data operator, and that is very aligned with what we just mentioned, need to have also, and also what the ecosystem needs. So we need data operators to work on both users and companies to build a more transparent and trustful ecosystem. And what I believe is very important is that we need to give transparency, and I put it this, and I want to mark transparency, because if we want to manage our data from one part to another, if we don't have transparency, it's very difficult to achieve that. And I believe that regulations talk a lot about control, how to move your data from one place to another, but doesn't specify too much about the transparency. And that is like a black box, and some regulations expect that the user will know everything about their data, and that's not true. So what I put is that we need to understand also as data operators that for years users was left behind from this equation or from this ecosystem. So we really need to educate them. We need to educate people to understand what means that a company have your data, what means in your data right, and also that something that's very important is we need to win their trust. And there also, again, I want to mention that's why these values are very important. To win the trust, users' trust, you need to show that your values will not change. Also, something very important, and what we learned here is that we cannot expect that regulations will solve everything. We need new solutions for both users and companies, and we need to push also from the technological side and as individuals too. And to sum up, we need to incentivize and educate new leaders of the future in privacy and data rights. I believe that today in a world where let's say millennials or centennials or I don't know which the new name, but are thinking only in maybe, or some of them are using too much TikTok, is to understand how TikTok or how other platforms use their data, which are their rights about this data and the importance of this. Because just mentioned that in 10 years this will be changing, and so we need to start educating the people that in 10 years will be the leaders of these companies or leaders in the political side writing these new regulations. So this is mainly a summary of what is Whitson, with what we have learned and how far what we reach. Of course, this is a constant learning, and I hope that maybe in the MyData conference or in other events, I will give you more details about this. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. This is a perfect response and an anticipation of what we're going to discuss at the MyData conference. Indeed, the session that was mentioned by Josh will take a specific perspective from Latin America. And I think some of the issues that you raised, especially in your comparison between the EU, US, and the rest of the world, are exactly what we should be discussing. So, you know, for example, in Brazil, a new data protection law was entered into force recently, and there's still a lack of guidance on what it means to be transparent. You know, what is that we can expect from companies, for example, when they do automated decision making or when they rely on the legitimate interest. You know, all these things need to be defined, and what is an advantage that, for example, the Brazilian law offers, but I think the same is in other frameworks. You have a role for self-regulation, so codes of conduct by companies that, you know, can define already what they think that transparency should mean, and that has, you know, is specifically recognized and can be you know, referred to in courts, legislation, etc. So this is something that we can work all together for, and, you know, in the future it will, if it's a model that is sustainable and accepted by many, I think it will have a role to play in steering the behavior of data controller towards a responsible processing. So now we have like 10 minutes for questions. We start a little bit later, so we go until 1:05. I see there's already a question from Hudson. I'll let him, I don't know, Hudson, if you want me to just read the question or you prefer to speak up yourself.
Hi, actually, it was not just a question. It's something that we need to make sure that we need to provide this. Like, people need to understand like the value of the data, and mainly understand that we are the final product, regardless of the scenario, independent what happens. So our data has a value, and we're going to treat this data by the end of the story. So the part of the lack of the awareness, as I said before, the acculturation, evangelization of the data, and what's the law prescript for everyone will be the final gap. So we're talking about here just not just to manage the data, how to, you know, get the data collected and how we're going to treat the data and so on. But by the end, the scenario will be we are the product. Okay, we need to make the people understand the value of this. Not just I'm saying that because I'll be facing this in Europe. I'm facing, especially in Germany and also Hungary as well. When I went to Malaysia and also Philippines, they have the same scenario. Argentina, for example, they have the the data protection authority already raised it by 20 years ago, and they still facing the problem with evangelization and acculturation. So we know people don't accept for in a good way, in an easy way, how the data has the value. So I think this is the big step, and there will be the biggest challenge that we're going to face it globally.
Yeah. And
Okay,
how?
so just my point of view on this. Okay.
Sure, sure. How can the operators stimulate this? I guess that Josh can connect that to the concept of my data operators, right? I mean, I think you wanted to say something.
No, no,
Yeah.
I was just considering that I agree with you. And I was this morning on a call at the IGF, and it's interesting looking at the role of the UN. If you start thinking about digital human rights, which could be one way of talking about this space, I think they will acknowledge that they have been criticised for being slow off the mark, that they have underinvested in this area, and I've heard them say that. But what they're talking about in how they're trying to drive this forward is about social inclusion. It's about how do we include everybody within the discussion, and that's how. And when you start looking at that, you begin very quickly to come to the point that you're making, that the way to do this is through education and providing choice. And that those words that I haven't talked very much about it here within the operators, because these are quite functional areas about tools for doing certain jobs, really, but making it clearer that those are jobs that need to be done, and that there are values that underpin them is an important context for our work, which I would take, the criticism that we're not very good necessarily at talking about, to your point.
Yeah, this needs to be very, very subtly and also objective, not not in aggressive way. So we need to start doing some implementation in terms of that, and a part of people need to see whatever place they will look, whatever place they will be. Uh, we were going to protect their data in whatever ways. So this part, I believe, for example, I went to the cine market yesterday, right? So they had this folder, this like small folder, saying something about the law, the protection law, saying, okay, so we're gonna film you, we're gonna record your image here, but we have the temporability of 2 hours to delete your data, something like that, not being aggressive. So we need to start making something like that, as not just as a DPO, as the way I am, and how I give the people, like my students as well, is something that I will always put on the table, saying, guys, you need to understand how the applicability of the law needs to be underground, like on the ground, right? You need to put that, making happen to people, not being something that will say, okay, it's someone it will impose you, like will say, okay, guys, you need to do that. No, don't need to be like that. Okay, we cannot be aggressive. So Nico, you want to say something?
Yes, I was going to say we are going to have in our panel at the MyData conference, we're going to have a project that tried to do exactly that. So it tried to promote, awareness, basic literacy about personal data. They went to different communities in Peru, and they started giving out manuals about how people can make more sense of their personal data. So that's
Yeah.
going to be an important discussion, I think. So great. So now let me move to another question. I see there's an hands up as well. Let us prioritize then this question very quickly, and it has to do with the methodology. Erika is asking about the methodology. I was gonna ask that in specifically as well. Rodrigo, when you said that you have divided replies or answers that you get from different companies. First of all, I wanted to know if this was a global perspective or it was focused on any particular region. And then I don't know if you can say something about the methodology, about what was the scope? So are you asking just about deletion requests, or were you asking about something else as well? So just to understand these percentages.
Perfect. Very good question. So first of all, there were users from all around the world that have their data also from different companies. These type of users give us all the consent to make this research and test. And yes, it was only for the data deletion request, mainly because our app now allows that request. It's automated because it's the easiest one to achieve. That is, okay, please delete my data, and they can confirm you. If you start asking, for example, a copy of your data, they will send you different type of data and different types, PDF, CSV, JSON, etc. So we started with that type of request, and mainly was when the user click, we send an email to the DPO of the company, and then the DPO of the company answered to the user. And we analyzed the response of these companies. In regards of where the companies are located, so Webson, of course, Webson have a little bit of users' data, because we analyze your email to find which companies have your data, and we say you which type of data these companies have, but we don't get into your data. We never know that. We have only very limited access to your data. So what we do is we created different solutions, applying AI solutions, and we enrich your data with public information of companies. So all the data of the companies goes to the user and to the user's phone. And in that way, we can give this information, for example, of where the companies, where the companies are, especially the headquarters of the companies or the DPO of the company. So in that way, we know if the company, where it's located, and what was the response of this company.
I see. Well, yeah, I have kind of the same problem here. I'm running this experiment with students with trying to test the new data protection law in Brazil, and at the same time use the GDPR with the same company, see if the response is different. And sometimes they refuse to reply because you are from Brazil, you know, and so it matters, you know, to understand where they are based and also where you are based when you're making the request. But okay, thank you very much. That was explanatory. We have a last question, so I don't want to close without hearing from Arturo, who has raised his hand. Arturo, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. So my question, I missed the first part of the first presenter, so I'm really sorry if this has been addressed, but we live in a region where half of the countries do not have a data protection law, and the other half that do have them not necessarily align with the right, let's say, framework that enables the emergence of data operators. So in a context where the data legislation does not necessarily allow or promote or enable the emergence of data operators, what could be done beyond just awareness raising among citizens? And I don't want with this by any means reduce the importance of it, but what could be done, you know, to promote the emergence of such operators in this environment or in this context? Thank you.
Yes, and let me add to that. I guess this is for Josh. What are the advantages? Maybe one way that we can promote that is by saying, look, if you sign up as a MyData operator, there's all these advantages. So I guess the two are related. So let's try to answer that question before we close.
I think so. I think there are one answer to that from taking a European perspective. That's the background I know. I won't try and answer your local context. The operators, the intermediaries that we've seen emerge in Europe and the US, they're quite different, but they have emerged in an environment where they are not regulated. I think it's quite important to point out that those intermediaries are not regulated at the moment. And you can see that they've taken, there are a number of approaches that have been taken. The ones which seem to have been more successful are those that market themselves towards the individual, but have very strongly partnered with large data consumers in the economy. So, for example, working with insurance businesses. So there's been a lot of funding of these sorts of initiatives by insurance businesses, not for nefarious reasons, but just that the insurance companies are looking for a role in the world. They're looking for a way of reaching out beyond their traditional base to create connections with consumers. And so Cozy Cloud's a really nice example in France, where they've worked with insurance companies to provide personal data stores for individuals, which makes it easier for those insurance companies then to insure them. Now, again, that may not be a great example within your local context, but it is an example of someone innovating outside the regulated space, recognizing that there are costs associated with moving data between the individual and an organization. And if the organization either has to bear that cost or their services cost more because of that burden, there is an opportunity for an intermediary to reduce that cost, and then they can offer the benefit to both sides. So that's what you've seen that strongly in non-regulated players as a dynamic that's created these organizations in Europe. In the US, you see a slightly different focus because, particularly around healthcare, because we've got a strongly commercialized healthcare system in the US, and data needs to be moved from different actors in the system. There are opportunities for healthcare intermediaries in the US that we don't see in Europe in the same way. And again, what they're doing is they're reducing the cost. And you can do that in a human-centric way. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, Arturo is raising one of the issues that are often brought up, which is what happens if you dress like a MyData operator, but in fact you're a data broker. You're just getting all the data and selling it to third party. How can, how to build trust in this model to make sure this doesn't happen?
And I'm not going to try and answer. I agree,
Yeah,
that's a really difficult, but I think it's a local question, because trust is a local question. Trust is an emotional response to the evidence which is available to an individual. We're not talking about IT trust here. We're not talking about trust between computer systems. We're talking about a human response. And actually, when you start looking at the retailers of consumer goods, they have similar challenges, and they've provided very good techniques over the years to solve those.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I think this introductory session to MyData operators has gotten everyone interested in this concept, hopefully, and we'll do more events and initiatives around this. So please stay tuned. Yeah, don't forget to join the conference, the MyData conference in December. All the information is online, but feel free to contact us if you have any questions. And again, thank Rodrigo and Josh for the excellent presentations, and everyone for the discussion.